Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little darker. A time of plagues, punishments, and pottage. We're diving into what life was really like during the Middle Ages. But not the gloomy castles or plague-ridden streets of Europe. No, tonight. We drift somewhere a little warmer, a little quieter, a little dustier. Let's wander southward past the Mediterranean coast, down through dry valleys, until we reach the soft golden belly of the Sahara Desert. The air here is dry and clean. Sand slips over stone with the weightless hush of time. And here, amidst the sand, sit cities, yes, real cities built of red mud, salt, and sun-hardened earth. Welcome to the world of Tabmeka, Walata, and Gao, trade cities, centers of learning and exchange, and, perhaps surprisingly, centers of bathing. In the Western imagination, the Middle Ages were filthy, but not everywhere, and not everyone. In many parts of medieval Africa, especially the Islamic regions of the Sahel and Sahara, cleanliness was woven into both daily routine and spiritual life. Bathing wasn't just about comfort, it was required, expected, culturally ingrained. Imagine yourself stepping off a camel after 3 days' travel. Your robe is stiff with salt. The wind has filled your ears and mouth with dust. And yet, you aren't looking for food first. You're looking for water not to drink, but to wash. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Let's talk about bathing in a land where water is more valuable than gold. In medieval Saharan cities, public bathhouses, rudimentary though they often existed near mosques and market centers. Unlike the grand tiled hammams of Damascus or Istanbul, these were simpler, rougher things. Walls of mud brick, thatched roofs or open skies, mats woven from palm fronds, and a few precious clay jars filled from wells or brought in from distant oases. Most Saharan bathhouses weren't public in the way Roman or Turkish ones were. They were often attached to wealthier homes, or set up for groups traders, religious pilgrims, or scholars. People bathed not in marble pools, but with wooden ladles and clay basins. They'd begin by scrubbing their skin with Sandiasis sand. Dry scrubbing helped remove sweat and oil. Then, when water was available, they poured it slowly over their heads. Not much, just a few handfuls. Enough to refresh, to purify. Soap, not bars, not as you know it. But yes, there was soap. In places like Gao and Timbuktu, women made a kind of soft soap from shea butter and ash, sometimes scented with desert herbs or tree resins. This wasn't the kind of lathering soap that fills your bathroom today, but more like a cleansing paste. It left the skin soft, not dry, and it smelled of earth, smoke, and wild plants. It was often the women of the household, mothers, sisters, or servants who prepared the washing area. Water had to be drawn at dawn, before the heat set in. It was kept in ceramic vessels, shaded under cloth to keep it cool. Sometimes heated over coals. Not for luxury, but necessity. Warm water softened hardened skin, and desert nights could be cold. Bathing wasn't always private. In some communities, neighbors gathered at wells in the early morning to splash, scrub, and chat, much like how city dwellers gossip at cafes. Modesty, of course, was important, but these weren't societies unfamiliar with the body. Cleanliness, both spiritual and physical, was considered part of honor. Islamic influence shaped much of this. In the 8th to 14th centuries, Islam spread across North and West Africa, carried by traders and scholars. And with it came the practice of water ritual washing before prayer and ghusl, the full body cleansing after specific events. This meant that even in water-scarce regions, people made great effort to stay clean. They learned how to stretch every drop. Some used sand when water wasn't available, a practice called tayammum. It sounds strange to modern ears, but rubbing clean sand across the body was recognized as an acceptable purification method in Islamic law. It symbolized the intent to cleanse when water could not be spared, and in the cities where water could be channeled from seasonal rivers or dug from deep wells. Communal bathhouses sometimes included steam, not true saunas, but hot rooms, heated with charcoal pits, where steam was generated by pouring water over stones. You'd sweat out the dust of the desert, then rinse with cool water. Some bathhouses doubled as social centers. Men discussed trade deals, read aloud from scrolls, or gossiped about new arrivals from Morocco or Egypt. Women, in their own private spaces, shared stories, combed each other's hair, applied scented oils to their skin. It was slow, rhythmic. Every action drawing water, heating it, pouring, it took time. It forced people to pause, to be present in their bodies. Now imagine, just for a moment, the sound of it. The hiss of water over hot stones, the creak of clay jugs, the soft rasp of a brush on skin, wind sighing through cracks in the wall, laughter. In the distance, the call to prayer echoing off mud brick walls. This was cleanliness, not just as habit, but as ritual. And yet, there were contradictions. Though hygiene was deeply valued, water scarcity forced trade-offs. Public health in these cities was always in tension with environment. Wells could run dry. Bathhouses were rare outside urban centers. Nomadic tribes had entirely different routines: dry scrubbing, oiling the skin, airing clothes in the sun. The question that lingers is this: how did societies so focused on cleanliness adapt when the environment resisted them at every turn? When the desert made daily washing an act of devotion or of defiance? And what happened when outsiders, Europeans, later on arrived and misunderstood these routines, or worse, judged them? We'll pick that thread up next time. Let's return now to the red clay walls of Gao, the trading city nestled along the Niger River. The sun hasn't fully risen yet. The markets are still quiet. But in the courtyards behind homes and mosques, something is already in motion. The water-bearers, young boys and hired workers, move with a calm, practiced rhythm. They carry large clay vessels on their shoulders, or balance them on donkeys. These vessels are heavy, sometimes weighing over 30 kilograms when full. The water inside is dark and cloudy. It must sit for hours to let the silt settle. It might be boiled, or not. But one thing is certain: it is not wasted. In the medieval Sahel, water wasn't just a natural resource, it was a form of currency. And bathing, though encouraged, was subject to strict calculation. Wells were precious, often guarded and tied to family lines or clans. The right to draw water might come through marriage, inheritance, or social status. In some towns, the location of a well could define the hierarchy of an entire neighborhood. If your house was near one, your life was easier, cleaner, healthier. In rural communities, water was even harder to come by. The seasonal rains were brief but intense. Villagers dug cisterns, underground water catchments, lined with clay or animal dung to seal the earth. These cisterns were opened only when the community agreed. Often they were used more for animals and crops than for humans. So how then did people stay clean? The answer lies in ritual and efficiency. Bathing in the medieval African context didn't always mean full immersion. Instead, it was about intentional purification. A large bowl, a small cloth, and a few ladles of water could go a long way in wealthier homes. Servants poured warm water over the shoulders, while another person gently scrubbed the back with rough fabric or fiber brushes. Children watched, learned, and mimicked. Bathing became a shared activity, not communal in the public sense, but generational. Mothers passed on methods, fathers modeled wudu, grandparents reminded the young not just how, but why. There was a spiritual rhythm to it all. 5 times a day, those who could afford the water performed wudu, washing the hands, mouth, face, arms, and feet. A few spoonfuls of water were all that was needed. The act mattered more than the volume. Cleanliness was godliness, but also awareness. To pause and wash was to remember the body, and by extension, the world. Soap production, too, became something of a ritual. The soft black soap used in many Saharan and West African households wasn't just for cleaning, it was a kind of medicine. Crafted by women in small batches, it combined shea butter, coconut oil when available, ash from burnt plantain skins or wood, and sometimes powdered herbs or clays. The resulting paste was dark, smooth, and slightly gritty. It smelled faintly, smoky, slightly sweet, and it was believed to carry protective qualities in sex, infection, and even spirits. You could buy this soap in markets, sure, but many preferred the homemade kind, especially when crafted during the dry season, when ingredients were freshest. These soaps were stored in calabash bowls or wrapped in dried leaves. Sometimes they were gifted at weddings or brought along on pilgrimages. In cities like Timbuktu, where scholarship flourished, even bathhouses had subtle hierarchies. Wealthier residents paid for private washing areas. Travelers used communal stalls where they poured water over themselves in rotation, often with someone counting to keep time. Yes, there were timers, of a sort. Not mechanical, but human. Old men might sit at the entrance of the washhouse, tapping stones or beating time on a bowl to signal when it was the next person's turn. Too long under the water, and someone would gently scold you. Brother, it is no longer your day. And yet, despite the effort to manage water, there was no shame in being dirty. What mattered was intention. You did your best with what you had. If there was no water, there was tayammum ritual cleansing with sand. If your clothing was soiled, you brushed it off, left it to air in the sun, or used smoke to drive away odor. The idea of washing extended beyond the body. It touched the soul. Before marriage ceremonies, both men and women underwent full body cleansing. Before burying the dead, families washed the body carefully, using scented oils if possible. Water was used to mark beginnings, endings, and transitions. Cleanliness wasn't cosmetic, it was cosmic. But this balance between reverence and resource was always fragile. Sometimes wells went dry. And when they did, everything changed. Livestock suffered. Families moved. Markets emptied. Even the bathhouses closed. People turned to alternative rituals. Scented smoke became more common. Sand cleansing returned. Head coverings lengthened. Hands were washed with ashes. In such times, bathing took on new meaning. It became an act of hope, a declaration that the rains would return, that the dust would not win. And when the rains did return, thunder cracking over cracked earth, people ran outside. not just to collect water, but to feel it, to stand in it, to let the sky do the washing. Some even believed rainwater had healing properties, that the first downpour of the season could cure skin diseases or bring clarity to troubled minds. Children bathed in puddles, elders gave thanks. The desert, momentarily, became a river. So now, as we drift further into this world, a question quietly surfaces. How did bathing and the meaning behind it change when outsiders began to write the history? Europeans often described Africa as dirty, uncivilized. But what did they misunderstand? What practices did they overlook or dismiss simply because they looked different? And how did African communities respond to that judgment? Did they change their rituals or hold them tighter? We'll explore that next. By the time Europeans began recording their impressions of West Africa in the late medieval and early modern periods, centuries of deeply rooted hygiene practices had already shaped the rhythms of daily life across the region. But you wouldn't know that from reading their journals to many. Foreign travelers, Portuguese sailors, Arab chroniclers, and later French colonial officers, Africa was dusty, foreign, and unbathed. They came with assumptions, expectations shaped by Roman baths, tiled aqueducts, and visions of marble palaces. In their eyes, cleanliness meant polish, perfume, porcelain tubs, a long soak, a servant waiting with a towel. What they encountered instead were clay pots of lukewarm water, rough fiber scrubs, and rituals that seemed deeply private, stripped of luxury, but full of intention. It confused them. And so, rather than ask, many simply judged. They wrote of primitive washing. They missed the nuance. They didn't understand that for many African communities, bathing wasn't something you displayed, it was something you carried with you. Modestly, quietly, as the 15th century moved on, Portuguese ships began docking along the West African coast. Traders moved inland, and with them came smallpox, Christianity, woolen trousers, and very different ideas of bathing. It's worth noting that by the 1500s, European hygiene had entered a strange decline. The collapse of Roman infrastructure, combined with new religious beliefs about modesty and disease, meant many Europeans bathed less than they had in antiquity. Public bathhouses had been shuttered in many regions due to fears of plague or immorality. Soap was harsh, sometimes caustic. Perfume became a replacement for water. So when Portuguese or Spanish explorers encountered African communities performing ghusl in the early morning sun, or scrubbing their feet before entering a mosque, the contrast was not what one might expect. Africans often bathed more regularly, and with greater purpose, than their European counterparts. But colonial narratives didn't reflect this. Instead, early records often omitted these details, or framed them as curiosities. One French officer, stationed near the Senegal River, wrote that the local women were obsessed with shea oil, coating themselves in thick, greasy paste. He perhaps didn't care that this practice protected against the sun, preserved moisture, and served as both skincare and social marker. The bathhouses he saw were dismissed as mud huts. He failed to note their order, their sacred geometry, or the care with which they were prepared each day. Over time, the perception hardened. African hygiene was seen as lesser, and with colonial pressure came change. Some bathhouses were dismantled, others were converted into storage rooms or administrative offices. In some towns, the communal washing traditions faded, replaced by European-style tub-washing wooden buckets, scented soaps, imported basins. But in the quiet spaces in courtyards, in the backs of mosques, in the shade of old wells, the rituals continued. There's a certain kind of power in tradition. It doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits. And in many parts of medieval Africa, hygiene held that kind of quiet power. Children still learned to fetch water before sunrise. They still learned to scrub their feet before entering prayer. Women still passed down the secret of the best ash for soap making, or the timing of the rain for catching the clearest water. And in times of drought or hardship, those traditions anchored communities. Even nomadic groups like the Tuareg carried their own bathing customs. Without cities or wells, they relied on seasonal springs, worn routes, and deep knowledge of terrain. They bathed, not frequently, but deliberately. Some carried small pouches of perfumed sand or powdered herbs to rub into their skin in place of water. They believed strongly in the balance between body and landscape. A clean body, they thought, was better prepared for the spirits of the desert. This wasn't about luxury, it was about presence. Let's return, one last time, to the soft breath of a Saharan morning. The kind of morning where the sky is silver blue and the wind feels like silk. In the quietest corner of a courtyard, a clay jug tips. Water falls not in a gush, but in a stream, measured, rhythmic. It slides across skin darkened by sun, across a neck bowed in concentration. The hands move with practiced carists, forearms, the space between fingers. There is no audience, no mirror, no need. This act done thousands of times over, generations is not forgotten, even if it's rarely recorded. And maybe that's the quiet lesson here, that history, true history, is not always loud. Sometimes it lives in the smallest gestures. A boy carrying water before dawn, a woman crushing soap berries into a bowl, a traveler rinsing his face after a long journey. Not all stories are told with drums and flags. Some are told with water, or sand, or silence. So tonight, as we close this story, maybe let your thoughts drift a bit. Drift to the soft sound of water falling in a clay bowl. Drift to the hush of sand brushing against skin. Drift to a place where staying clean was never easy, but always worth the effort. And ask yourself, how many other stories have we missed, simply because they weren't told the way we expected? That's the end of the bathhouse beneath the dunes. Next, we'll begin an entirely new journey, new city, new rituals, and new forgotten corners of the medieval world. Up in the Ethiopian highlands, where the air is thin and cool and the mountain peaks cradled the clouds, people once woke not to the sound of bustling markets or marching feet, but to the soft creak of wooden doors, the rustle of woven grass mats, and the smell of fire smoke curling up from a hearth that never quite went cold in the villages scattered across these rugged cliffs and lush valleys. Bathing was never rushed, nor was it especially luxurious, but it was deeply woven into the pattern of everyday life. You wouldn't see large bathhouses, hear no tiled floors, no domed ceilings. Instead, you'd find warm bowls, carved from olive wood or acacia, sitting by the fireplace, their surfaces smooth from years of use. You'd find straw brooms, dried leaves tied in bundles, and clay jars of water tucked close to warm stones to heat through the night. The water didn't come from wells, not always. In the highlands, people harvested rain. Stone cisterns caught the runoff from sloped thatch roofs. In some places, the morning mist condensed enough to fill small troughs carved into rock. A cup here, a bowl there. Enough men and women would rise just before dawn, especially in the colder seasons, and begin their quiet routines. The fire would be stirred, not for cooking yet, but to heat water for washing. A wooden lid would be lifted from a clay pot, and warm water, never hot, just gently warmed, would be poured into a wide bowl, and then the washing would begin. Bathing in these mountain communities was rarely full-body immersion. The climate made that difficult. The highland air could be biting, especially at altitude, and water, though cleaner than in many drier regions, was not to be wasted. Instead, people washed in stages. Face first always, the face. Then hands and arms, legs, feet. In some families, there was a particular order passed down. Left foot before right, neck last, hair only on holy days. Soap, if used at all, was made at home, often from the ashes of enset leaves, false banana trees, mixed with water and pressed into rough cakes. These weren't soft or scented, but they were effective, and they smelled of the earth, of the forest, of smoke and sun. It wasn't unusual for a child to watch an elder prepare this soap. There was rhythm in it, crushing, stirring, waiting, drying, like making bread. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't just cleaning. It was continuity. Religion, too, shaped the habit of bathing. Ethiopia in the Middle Ages was a deeply spiritual land home to early Christianity, rooted in centuries-old monastic traditions, woven with even older beliefs that danced quietly beneath the surface. For many, especially in Orthodox Christian households, cleanliness was both practical and sacred. Before entering a church or praying near a Tabitha sacred replica of the Ark of the Covenant, one washed. Always. Some even believed that impure skin could hinder the path of a prayer. So, before feast days or pilgrimages, people bathed with more care, not lavishly, but with purpose. Clothes were scrubbed, hair was combed, feet, often bare and calloused from walking the steep mountain paths, were scrubbed with sand or dried herbs. In monasteries, especially those perched high above the valleys, places like Debra, Damo, or Abuna Yamadabe, was even more rich. Water was carried up steep cliffs in goatskins. It was precious, and the act of washing, once allowed, was nearly monastic in its silence. Eyes down, hands methodical. Even hermits, living in caves or rock-cut cells, practiced a form of bathing, washing with sand, or smoke cleansing using aromatic wood. The body, even in isolation, was not to be neglected. And yet, bathing here was not showy, it was not discussed. No one boasted of how clean they were. It was private, almost sacred. In some families, children weren't even allowed to bathe without an elder's guidance, not because they couldn't, but because it was seen as a moment of learning, a small rite of passage. Bathing could also be seasonal. During the rainy months, when the hills turned green and the air was thick with moisture, people washed more often. There was more water, more mud, more reason to scrub. But in the dry months, priorities shifted. Water was boiled for tea, for grain, for the sick. Washing was shortened, sometimes skipped, and replaced with careful grooming. Hair was braided, clothes aired in smoke, hands wiped with herbal cloths. Even then, the sense of care remained. Cleanliness wasn't about appearing polished. It was about dignity, about being ready to meet others, to sit with neighbors, to pray. If you walked through a highland village in those times, you might not know who had bathed that morning, but you would notice the small signs. A bowl of water, cooling by a hearth. Damp footprints on smooth stone. A linen cloth, freshly wrung and hung to dry in the breeze. You might smell eucalyptus leaves smouldering in a corner, filling the hut with a clean, sharp scent. Or besobilla, an herb used to freshen clothing and hair. You wouldn't hear much. Bathing didn't involve chatter. It was a quiet part of the day, a pause between sleep and work, between waking and prayer, and perhaps the most interesting thing, these rituals, practiced for centuries in the craggy folds of the Ethiopian mountains, barely show up in the records. European visitors who came later wrote about the churches carved into rock, about the kings and their crosses, but they rarely wrote about the small wooden bowl near the fire, or the slow scoop of warm water in the morning, or the hands that washed a child's feet before a long walk to church. So much of history is loud, but not this part. This is the kind of history that lives in the background, that lingers in the smell of ash soap and the steam of boiled water, the kind that doesn't need to be seen to be remembered. Now, as we leave this quiet village for the night, one gentle question rises. What does it mean that so much of medieval cleanliness survives only in memory, not in monuments or books, but in rituals passed hand to hand? In the quiet rhythm of mountain life, there was a pattern to how the day unfolded, and at the center of it, before meals, before prayer, before labor was washing, always, in one form or another, but here, in the highlands, where water could be scarce and warmth even scarcer, cleanliness wasn't just about water. It was about tools, temperature, and timing. And perhaps, most importantly, it was about knowing your surroundings. Let's talk about fire for a moment. In medieval Ethiopia, every home, from stone dwellings to thatched huts, had some form of hearth. It wasn't always central, and it wasn't always visible to guests, but it was always there. A low fire that never fully went out. Smouldering charcoal, embers tucked beneath ash, ready to flare up again when needed. Fire heated food, of course, but it also heated water. And water, warmed to just the right degree, made all the difference. Too cold, and washing became a shiver-inducing task. Too hot, and it wasted precious heat and threatened cracked bowls or scalded hands. There was an art to it, watching the way the steam curled, dipping a finger to check warmth, judging by scent and feel rather than thermometer. Once the water was ready, it was mixed with other things. Sometimes salt drawn from the highland markets where rock salt was traded like gold. Sometimes crushed herbs, wild basil or tenedam, known not just for its aroma but for its cleansing properties. But the most common addition, ash. Wood ash might not sound elegant, but in many cultures, especially in medieval Africa, it was essential. It wasn't just filler. Ash had alkaline properties. Mixed with water, it created a mild lipe effect for cutting through oils and dirt. Not harsh enough to irritate skin when properly prepared, but just enough to scrub clean. In Ethiopia, women often collected ash from burned enset leaves or acacia wood, known for producing fine, pale ash. This ash was sifted and stored in small pots. When mixed with warm water, it formed a slurrier greyish paste that, when applied with hands or rough cloth, became a gentle exfoliant. Scrubbing was done with flat stones, loofahs made from dried vines, or even rolled up fibers from old garments. And always with care, not just because skin was sensitive, but because this was a daily practice. The goal wasn't to be spotless. The goal was to be balanced, refreshed, ready to meet the day with clarity and humility. It's easy to forget that cleanliness wasn't just physical. It had social meaning to. In most villages, If you showed up to the church on a feast day without washing, people noticed. If your clothes smelled of smoke but not of herbs, or your hair was uncombed, it might signal more than laziness. It might suggest illness, or mourning, or something deeper, disconnection from the shared rhythm of the community. You see, even in places without mirrors, appearance mattered. Not in the way we might think today, not with makeup or fine garments, but in posture, scent, presence. A person who bathed regularly showed a kind of internal order. They were in step with the flow of the village. They had not allowed the burdens of farming or fasting or fatigue to pull them away from this simple, grounding ritual. Bathing, in this way, became a language, a message, quietly delivered, of belonging. There were also more formal versions of cleanliness moments. When washing became ceremony, childbirth, for instance, brought an entire set of rituals. After a birth, the mother would remain secluded for several days, sometimes up to 2 weeks, depending on the local custom. During this time, her bathing was limited. Only warm cloths were used, and her hair was often oiled but not washed. But when the time came, after this protective period, she would be bathed by her closest female relatives, gently, in silence. The water would be warmed with fire and mixed with dried flowers or herbs, known for their healing properties, chamomile, thyme, maybe even a splash of goat's milk, if the family could spare it. This was not simply about hygiene. It was about transition from pregnancy to motherhood, from solitude to rejoining the life of the village. The same was true of death. When someone passed away, their body was washed, always, even if water was scarce, even if time was short. The hands, the feet, the face, washed and wrapped in clean cloth. Some believed this helped the soul on its journey. Others believed it simply honored the life that had been bought. Everyone agreed it was necessary. No one should be buried with the day's dirt still on them. There's a particular kind of stillness that settles over the highlands at night. It's not silence exactly. There's always the wind, the rustle of trees, the distant bark of dogs, but it feels hushed, like the mountains themselves are sleeping. In those quiet hours, the hearth coals would dim again. Children, if they were very young, might be bathed one final time before bed. Not a full wash, just the hands, the face, maybe a damp cloth behind the ears. Their skin still warm from firelight, wrapped in thin cloth. They would drift to sleep, and in the mornings, the same cycle would begin again, fetching water, heating it, checking the ash, preparing the bowl. This wasn't dramatic. No one made speeches. No one recorded these routines. But that's the point. The people of medieval Ethiopia didn't see themselves as writing history. They were simply living. And in living, they preserved something profound, a form of cleanliness that wasn't about display or decadence, but about rhythm, grounding, humility. So tonight, as we sit quietly in this distant mountain village, half a world away, half a millennium ago maybe, the question is, how many of the world's deepest traditions still echo today in acts so small we forget to notice them? Far beyond the villages and the gentle fireside routines, there were places in the Ethiopian highlands where water didn't just clean, it healed. Springs, tucked deep into forests or bubbling out from rock ledges, were known not just for their freshness, but for their spiritual power. People didn't just walk to these springs, they journeyed, sometimes days, sometimes barefoot, sometimes fasting. Not everyone went to bathe, of course. Many went to pray. But even those who came with bowed heads and whispered psalms often ended up wading in, not to wash away dirt, but to lay down burdens, illness, guilt, grief. There was a spring near Lake Tana, they say, where monks had once bathed on the eve of great fasts. The water was cold, startlingly soap. It was believed to cleanse not just the skin, but the soul. Some claimed you could feel your worries peeling away with each scoop. No records remain. Only stories passed from grandmothers to grandchildren. But they persist. And in a world without photographs or paper journals, persistence is its own kind of truth. In many Highland communities, there were midwives who also served as ritual bathers. Their role wasn't glamorous, but it was essential. They knew which herbs soothed inflammation, which leaves, when crushed and steeped, made a calming rinse for sore limbs or fevered skin. They made cloths from bark fibers, dried flat and pounded soft. And they kept careful notes not in ink, but in memory. A midwife might say nothing while washing a newborn. Her hands would move with practiced calm. One bowl for rinsing, another for collecting what was washed away. She'd hum a tune, low and repetitive, as if time itself could be rocked gently to sleep. The act of bathing someone else, especially the very young, the very old, or the ill, was considered a quiet form of prayer. Not flashy, not showy, but deeply reverent. And again, almost none of this made it into the written records. European chroniclers, when they visited the Abyssinian kingdom, often marveled at the rock-hewn churches or the grandeur of royal processions. They wrote about battles, about treaties, about the treasures of kings, but they said very little about bathing to them. The absence of large Roman-style bathhouses meant people didn't wash. That was their frame of reference. If it wasn't marble and mosaics, it wasn't a bath. But they missed the truth. They didn't see the low clay pots tucked beside the hearth, the ash cakes left to dry near a kitchen wall, the way a girl no older than 10 might kneel to wash her grandfather's feet in silence. This was bathing too, maybe not by European standards, but by human ones. There's a peculiar thing about the history of hygiene. It often disappears, clothes rot, soap dissolves, wooden basins crack and crumble with age. And what remains? Stone, metal, text, which means we end up remembering the buildings, the battles, the bold declarations, but not the slow, daily acts that made life livable. That's why these small traditions matter. They remind us that history isn't just made by those who ruled. It's shaped by those who stirred the fire, heated the water, sifted the ash dot. It's shaped by women who carried water from springs at dawn, balancing clay jars on cloth-wrapped heads, by boys who learned how to wash behind their ears before church, by the rhythm of hands squeezing out damp cloths and hanging them to dry again and again. Through years of sun and rain, we often think of the Middle Ages as dirty, chaotic, unsanitary. And in some places they were. But in Ethiopia high, on those mountain ridges, people found a balance. Their world was not sterile, but it was mindful. Cleanliness wasn't about scent or sparkle. It was about readiness, to pray, to mourn, to host a guest, to greet the sunrise with open hands and a body at peace. And perhaps that's what made it so lasting. Even now, in some rural Ethiopian homes, you'll still find traces of these practices. Ash soap, herb, bundles, bowls by the fire, not because someone read about it in a book, but because it was never forgotten. So what do we make of it all? What do we take from this quiet story of water and wood, fire and ash? Maybe this: that history lives not only in noise, but in ritual. In the small acts repeated 1,000 times without fanfare. The kind of acts that cradle a culture, that hold a people together when kingdoms fall and languages change. Washing, in the medieval highlands, was never just a task. It was a thread, woven through life, through birth and death, faith and fatigue, dawn and dusk, and tonight, as we close this story with the imagined creak of a wooden bowl being set beside a dying fire, we are left with a final, lingering thought, if. The quietest rituals of history are the ones we most easily forget. What might we already have lost? It's early morning in the Medina of Fez, sometime around the 11th century. The sky is a dusty, pale blue, not quite bright yet, but already warm. The call to prayer has just echoed through the alleyways, bouncing off the soft ochre walls like a whisper in a bathhouse. And if you're standing near the Karaween Quarter, you might catch a scent riding the breeze, sharply clean, earthy, almost bitter. It's the smell of soap, but not the perfumed kind you're imagining. This isn't lavender or rose, it's more pungent. A mix of lye and smoke, crushed olives and lemon ash. And it means one thing. The soap boilers have already started their fires. Fez, the jewel of medieval Morocco, wasn't just a center of Islamic learning. It was a city of craftsmen. And among the many guilds tucked into its winding street, stanners, potters, scribes, weavers, none kept longer hours or hotter rooms than the soap makers. Their work began long before sunrise. Always the main ingredient. Olives, not the soft, brined ones served at feasts, but the leftover pulp from oil pressing, the discarded skins, pits, and thick paste known as jift. In most parts of the world, this was considered waste, but in Fez, it was transformed. Olive oil, particularly the lower grade kind extracted from second or third pressings, was prized by soap artisans. It had just enough residual acidity and fat content to emulsify properly with alkaline agents. The color was often cloudy, the smell sharp, but it didn't matter, because by the time it was mixed with the right ingredients, it would become the base of something essential. Saboon bildi, the old-fashioned soap. In Arabic, saboon comes from the same root as the Latin sapa, meaning soap butt. The Moroccan version had its own character. It was thick, paste-like, almost black, and it wasn't made in molds. It was scooped, stored, smeared by hand. To understand how it was made, you'd need to duck your head into one of the city's soap workshops called Mammal. These were often low buildings with wide chimneys and clay brick ovens, their insides blackened from decades of use. At the center of each workshop was a vast copper cauldron, large enough for a man to sit inside if it were empty. Into this cauldron went the oil. Then came lime-burnt and crushed limestone that had been slaked with water until it hissed and steamed. Sometimes potash from burnt plant ash was added, sometimes a bit of salt. Then the boiling began. Hours of it, sometimes a full day, the soap. Master stirred with a giant paddle, watching them mix carefully. Too little heat, and it would stay separated useless. Too much, and it would burn. The goal was a smooth, slick paste that pulled away from the paddle in slow, heavy drips. It was exhausting work. Sweat would roll down the backs of the apprentices as they fed the fire with olive pits and palm fronds, trying not to breathe too deeply of the caustic smoke. But the smell, that sharp, unmistakable smell, meant it was working. Once the soap was boiled, it was left to cure. Not in fragrant drying rooms, but in wide, flat basins lined with clay, open to air, sometimes shaded with woven palm mats. Over days or weeks, the paste would thicken and darken. The more it aged, the milder it became. There was no need for packaging. Local women came with their own ceramic pots or scraps of cloth. They scooped what they needed, paid by weight, and went home. Soap wasn't luxury. It was routine, used for washing clothes, for scrubbing dishes, for cleaning babies, for preparing bodies for burial. It didn't lather like modern soap. There were no bubbles, just a slippery, earthy smear that left your skin strangely clean. And faintly olive-scented, the Guild of Soap Makers had rules. You couldn't just set up a cauldron and start boiling. You needed apprenticeship, approval, and often family ties. In many cases, the art of soap making passed from father to son. Not just the recipes, but the instincts. How to read the color of the boil, how to adjust the ash ratio when the lime was weak, how to recognize spoiled oil by scent alone. There were women involved, too, though not as cauldron stirrers. They worked in the home, using soap in careful, ritualistic ways. A mother would instruct her daughter how to scrub wool for weaving, how to bathe before visiting a holy shrine, how to prepare the body of a relative who had passed in this way. Soap wove its way through the daily life of Fez, not just as a substance, but as a symbol of readiness, of purity, of respect, cleanliness in medieval Islamic North. Africa was more than habitat, was part of faith. Before each prayer, 5 times a day Muslims performed wudu, the ritual ablution. Not a full bath, but a washing of hands, mouth, nose, face, arms, head, and feet. Soap wasn't required, but it was often used, especially before Friday prayers, or during holy festivals. bathhouses were common throughout Fez, not just for bathing, but for socializing, resting, and preparing. For major life events, brides visited hammams before their weddings, men before important negotiations, new mothers before returning to public life, and in every hammam, somewhere behind the steam and mosaic walls, a basin of black olive soap waited. If you close your eyes and listen closely, you can almost hear it now. The scrape of a paddle in thick paste, the clink of ceramic pots, the rush of water over tile floors, and beneath it all, the low murmur of a city that, despite its dust and noise and labor, made time to clean, not for beauty, not for show, but because it was part of the rhythm of life. And yet, one can't help but wonder, in a world that boiled its soap from waste and ash and sweat did, the people of Fez see cleanliness not as escape from labor, but as the labor itself. The heat inside the hammam was different from the desert. Heat outside, the sun baked the streets with a dry, blinding glare. Inside, the warmth pressed from the floors and the walls themselves, as if the stone had learned to breathe, and it breathed steam. There were no windows, just slits in a dome for light. The air shimmered gently, the moisture settling on your skin the moment you stepped in. And always, somewhere close by, there was the unmistakable aroma of black soap. Sabun bildi. It didn't lather like modern soap. It didn't sparkle. But when mixed with warm water and rubbed between the palms, it formed a rich, dark smear that softened the skin, unclogged the pores, and gave the body a strange, earthy cleanness. The kind of cleanness that didn't feel artificial. Just ... restored ... women came in groups. They brought buckets, cloths, copper bowls, and soap wrapped in linen. Elder women washed younger ones. Mothers rubbed their daughters' backs. Friends took turns scrubbing each other's arms with coarse mitts made of goat hair or rough linen, known as kessa. There was talking, of course, murmurs, jokes, advice, but also long silences, especially in the hottest room, where the steam rose, like incense, and every bath had a rhythm before entering the hammam. A woman might spend hours preparing washing garments, heating water at home, grinding herbs to mix with her soap. For special occasions, she might even add orange blossom water or eucalyptus to the basin. The act wasn't just about washing away sweat or dirt. It was about readiness. Readiness to pray, to mourn, to marry, to return to her husband after childbirth, or sometimes simply to start a new week. For men, the ritual was no less structured. They arrived early in the morning or after the midday prayer. Older men sat by the walls, while younger ones splashed water onto the tiles and flexed their shoulders. In the steam, barbers operated just outside, offering haircuts or beard trims as a finishing touch. But inside, the soap ruled. A young man might be scrubbed by a Teleka professional bath attendant who worked his palms in strong circles, muttering quietly as he kneaded muscles and exfoliated dead skin. There were no spas, no creams, no perfumes, just heat, water, and soap born from olives and ashdot. And when they were done, they would lie back, wrapped in woven cloth, eyes closed. The world softened and distant, but cleanliness wasn't only practiced in bathhouses. Back in the Medina, soap was currency, figuratively and sometimes literally. A good block of black soap could be given as a gift to a midwife, traded for herbs, or used in a dowry chest. It had value, not flashy value, but quiet, dependable worth. Soap was used in childbirth, in mourning, in hospitality. Before Ramadan, it was common for households to prepare extra soap, stored carefully in ceramic pots and sealed against air. Before Eid, it was used to scrub cooking vessels, wash prayer garments, and cleanse the body for morning prayers. Every household had a bar or at least a smear of black soap. Even the poorest families, who ate dry bread and wore threadbare robes, made room for it, because soap was not a luxury in Fez. It was survival. It was reverence. It was routine. And so, from the boiling cauldrons of the soap makers to the tiled walls of the hammamas, a quiet chain of cleanliness stretched through the city. Each link mattered. The man who shoveled ash from the lime kiln, the woman who ground eucalyptus leaves into powder, the child who fetched water from the cistern, the apprentice who stirred the cauldron before dawn, sweat pouring into the mix. They never made it into history books. No chronicler from Cordoba or Cairo wrote about the soap guilds of Fez. They wrote about scholars, about architecture, about trade routes and dynasties. But without soap, the robes of the imams would have yellowed with age. The hands would have cracked. The very ink they used often fixed with gum. Arabic and soot would have smeared, if not handled with clean fingers. There's a phrase sometimes, heard in old Maghrebi proverbs, purity without water is dust. But purity with effort, that is prayer. It's hard to know where it came from, but it fits, because soap, in the world of medieval Fez, wasn't for display. It was for readiness, for humility, for preservation. It made you fit to enter a mosque, a kitchen, or a deathbed. It prepared you not just for living, but for being seen, and there was something deeply democratic about it. Whether you were a scholar or a merchant, a leather worker or a shepherd, the soap washed everyone the same. We rarely think of cleanliness as equalizing. In the modern world, it's tied to status. Designer toiletries, perfumed soaps, branding dots, but in the narrow alleys of Fez, with their dripping fountains and clay bowls, the rules were simpler. Soap was made from leftovers, from pulp, from fire, and yet it held the power to cleanse not only skin, but spirit. That's what makes it so remarkable and so easy to miss. So tonight, as the scent of ash and olive still lingers in the hammam steam, we ask a gentle question. If something so humble could define the rhythm of a city, what quiet rituals shape our lives now, unnoticed? There's something quietly satisfying about a used-up bar of soap. Thin, cracked, almost translucent. You can't scrub much with it, but you hesitate to throw it away. It feels like a little end of something, a ritual completed, a life cycle finished. In medieval Fez, this feeling was a daily one. For centuries, soap was made, used, and remade in rhythms as steady as prayer. But like all rhythms, it changed. By the 13th century, the city was reaching its peak. Its streets echoed with dozens of languages: Arabic, Berber, Hebrew, Andalusian, Spanish, even scraps of Latin from traders or missionaries passing through. The tanners near the Wadi Fez darkened the sky with their vats. The scholars of Al-Qarawin debated medicine, theology, and law. And behind the scenes, the soap makers boiled their cauldrons as always. But their craft had begun to move. Fez was not an island. It was a hub. Goods flowed through it like water through a fountain, and among the many things that passed through its gates, buses, scrolls, silk, there was soap. Bundles of black soap wrapped in goat leather were sent north to cities like Tlemcen and Tunis, and sometimes even farther to Almeria, Seville, or Cairo, carried by camel caravans or coastal traders. The thick paste of Fez began to leave its scent on other markets. In Al-Andalus, the term sabon was adopted from Arabic. In southern France, soap makers began experimenting with their own formulas: almond oil, or animal fats, or imported soda ash. And though these new soaps were lighter in color and firmer in texture, the legacy of Fez's black soap remained. In some form or another, every bar still owed a debt to the cauldrons of the Maghreb. Even centuries later, European visitors to North Africa would write sometimes dismissively about the locals' obsession with cleanliness, how often they bathed, how often they washed their hands, how their clothing, though simple, was scrubbed daily. What they failed to grasp was that in Islamic culture, especially in cities like Fez, cleanliness was not luxury. It was law, spiritual law. But just as soap moved outward, so too did change move inward. By the 14th century, new methods of soap production began to appear. In the Levantes, especially in cities like Aleppo and Nablus, soap makers were using sodium hydroxide and drying their soaps into hard, stamped bars. These were easier to transport, easier to portion, and though they lacked the rich oiliness of black paste soap, they spread quickly. Fez, always proud and slightly insular, resisted for a time. But economies shift, even when tradition is strong. More and more, hard soaps began to appear in the markets of Morocco, imported, branded, wrapped in waxed paper with inked seals. The soap makers of Festa Old Mammal guilds kept boiling their cauldrons. But slowly, the demand for their thick black paste declined, and yet, not all was lost. Even as the city modernized, small batches of sabun bildi were still made. Women still came to the hammam with jars of homemade soap. Elderly men still swore. It was the only thing that could properly clean the feet after a long journey. And in rural towns beyond Fezin, Zawayat, Sidi Hamad, or Balil, Or the Atlas villagers' families still pressed olives and boiled soap the way their grandparents had. The rhythm slowed, but it did not disappear, because, for the people of Fez, soap had never been just about dirt. It was about readiness, belonging, memory. There's a certain humility in the history of soap. It's not mentioned in royal chronicles. It's not carved on mosque walls, but it sits quietly in every household story. A boy remembers his mother scrubbing his back. A bride recalls her wedding day bath. An old man clutches a lump of soap like a relic as he prepares for his last prayers. Soap connected people not by wealth or power, but by care. A bar of soap was something you used up, something that touched your skin, something passed from hand to hand, from body to water to earth. And in the great empires of the Middle Ages, with all their conquests and books and gold, it was the soap makers who kept the cities clean, not with speeches, not with armies, but with ash, oil, and patience. Today, if you visit Fez, you might still find it, tucked behind a tanner's shop, hidden down a side alley near the Bu Inenia Madrasa. A tiny mammal, still blackened with soot, still warm from the morning fire. A wrinkled man stirring a copper pot with a wooden pole, his hands stained dark, his nose red from the smoke. You might walk past and not even notice. You might think it's just another craftsman, doing something old and irrelevant. But if you stop just for a second, you might smell it. That sharp, earthy scent, a little bitter, a little sweet, and for just a moment, you'll be back in a time when soap wasn't a product, it was a practice. So as we close the lid on this quiet, sudsy tale, let's consider, in a world rushing toward convenience and polish, what are the rituals we're letting slip down the drain unnoticed? Do we still wash for readiness, or just for speed? Because maybe, just maybe, there's still something sacred in the scrape of old soap on skin. It begins with rain, not a drizzle, not a polite sprinkle, but the kind of rain that soaks the bones of the earth, the kind that makes roofs of packed mud groan under the weight. It doesn't announce itself with thunder, it simply arrives. A soft murmur at first, then a rising voice. And in the villages of what is now Mali, Burkina Faso, northern Ghana, or the inland stretches of Senegal, the people didn't run from it. They waited for it, welcomed it, because rain wasn't just a season, it was a basin, a mirror, a form of water you didn't have to carry before the stone-lined wells, before the imported steel hand pumps or deep boreholes. Water meant walking. It meant women and children with wide hips and bare feet, balancing calabashes or clay pots on their heads, sometimes for miles. There were rivers, to be sure. The Niger curled through the inland like a snake made of mirrors. But not every village lived near its banks. In the dry season, streams withered into cracked earth. The ponds grew thick with silt, frogs, and forgotten laundry soap. So when rain came, it changed everything. It puddled in the grooves between homes. It ran in long ribbons through the baobab roots. It filled dugout hollows with cool, muddy. The villagers used every drop. Bathing happened right there. Under the clouds, in courtyards, in gullies, in shallow clay pits carved long ago, their edges worn smooth by generations of feet. Children squealed and chased each other in the wet grass. Women pulled their wrappers tight and crouched, using a bowl to splash water over their shoulders. Men squatted quietly behind millet stalks or leaned against trees, their backs turned, their hands methodical, and no one thought it odd. There was no need for privacy when there was ritual. and no shame in being washed by the sky itself. But bathing wasn't only about dirt. In many West African traditions, to bathe was to reset the spirit. Mother might wash her newborn in water that had been mixed with crushed kola nuts and leaves from a neem tribolive to protect the child from evil eyes. A widow in mourning might avoid water for days, then return to it through a slow, symbolic cleansing, her sisters washing her arms, her aunt pouring water down her back. The elderly, especially women, kept herbs tucked behind their huts, dried bark, bitter roots, bundles of leaves wrapped in twine. They were soaked in rainwater or boiled over coals to make bathing mixtures, not for perfume, but for protection. Protection from fever, from misfortune, from bad dreams, and all of this was done in silence. Not sacred silence, necessarily, but practical, respectful stillness. Because bathing was not a task you rushed. Before soap, ash was king. Fine white ash from burned wood sometimes, she would. Sometimes millet chaff was mixed with water into a kind of paste. It was gritty, slightly alkaline, and excellent for scrubbing. Women used it to wash pots, but also their own arms and legs. It didn't foam, but it worked. Later, simple soaps appeared, homemade bars made from shea butter, or oil from pressed seeds, mixed with lye from ash. These were precious, kept wrapped in cloth or tucked into calabash bowls, used sparingly. You didn't waste soap on children playing in puddles. You used it when the body needed real attention, before a burial, before a wedding, before the first planting of the season. Even hair was treated with intention. Mixtures of mud, herbs, and water were massaged into scalps, not just for cleansing, but for strength, for blessing. Washing, in other words, was layered. A man might rinse his face each morning from a bowl, but to bathe, to truly wash, was a thing of rhythm, a thing of readiness. And what of the rivers? Ah, the rivers in villages, lucky enough to live by a slow, wide bend of the Niger or Senegal or Volta. The river was both bathhouse and boundary. People bathed in the mornings, when the sun was still low and the water not yet too warm. Men on one side, women on the other, children darting between them like little fish. There were rules. You didn't wash clothes where people bathed. You didn't spit in the water. You didn't fish too close to where someone might be rinsing. And always, always you poured a little water over your hands before stepping in, not to cleanse them, but to greet the river, because the river had seen many things. It had taken lives and given life. It had carved the land long before the villages were built. To enter it carelessly was to forget who you were. It's easy now to think of these routines as primitive, as if the lack of plumbing meant a lack of purpose. But in truth, the absence of convenience gave birth to depth. When water came only through rain, it was respected. When bathing required intention, it carried meaning. No one rushed a bath when it meant a long walk or the last bowl of clean water, and so every splash mattered. We think of hygiene today as sterile, a matter of soap dispensers and sterile wipes. But in West Africa, centuries ago, bathing was a sensual, rhythmic part of life. The scent of wet earth, the touch of cool water on sore muscles, the sound of a child being gently scolded as they tried to play in the water set aside for a ritual wash. These were the things that tied body and spirit to the land itself. So tonight, as the sky darkens and the air grows still, one can wonder, what did it mean to live in a world where being clean had to be earned? One muddy step at a time. The first wells weren't really wells. They were more like wide holes, dug by hand, lined with woven reeds or bundles of sticks. Some were only a few feet deep, just far enough to collect the last traces of water clinging to the earth after the rains. But they were a beginning, as the rhythm of village life settled into centuries of cycles: wet season, dry season, planting, harvest, hunger times. People began to understand that the surface would not always provide. The rivers retreated. The rain became unreliable. What was once washing water became too precious even to drink. So they dug. In some places, men dug in teams, one inside the hole, the other lifting out buckets of soil and passing them hand to hand. The walls were braced with clay, or sometimes ringed with carved stone. When a trickle of water was finally found, it was cause for celebration. But celebration didn't last long, because water, especially standing water, was tricky. The very wells, meant to save lives, could just as easily sour them. Shallow water went green quickly. Insects laid eggs. Small animals sometimes fell in. And with no lid, no cover, no way to strain at what you pulled up might carry as much sickness as salvation. So care became ritual. Women covered their pots when fetching. Boys were taught never to dip their hands in the well, only the ladle. Wells were kept swept and ringed with stones to keep livestock back. And though the water might look cloudy or taste metallic, it was still respected, still needed, and always shared. Because in the village, no one owned a well. The water belonged to everyone, even if you didn't get along with your neighbor. You didn't bar them from the rope. Bathing from the well was different from bathing in rain. Rain came freely, poured over your shoulders, ran down your back in sheets. It was loud, generous. Well water was quiet. Measured, you fetched only what you needed. A calabash for rinsing the baby, a bowl for a new mother to cleanse herself, a splash to wake up in the morning. There were stories of spirits that lived at the bottom of old wells, of women who leaned too far and disappeared, of men who claimed they could see reflections of ancestors in the still water just before dawn. Whether believed or not, these stories did what they were meant to do. They taught respect, and in a world without running taps, respect was the only thing that kept water clean. Yet still, people adapted. In some communities, clay jars were buried partway in the ground, their insides lined with charcoal and sand. Rainwater, when it came, could be caught and stored. These systems were gears, no pumps, but they worked. For weeks, sometimes months, families could draw water slowly, preserving its clarity. Even washing changed. Instead of full-body rinses, women learned to pour water from small cups in precise amounts, just enough to dampen the skin before scrubbing. With ash or soap, children were washed in pairs. Water was reused, in careful order from cleanest to dirtiest, to make the most of each drop. Ash was mixed with lemon or tamarind. Shea oil was added to soothe skin cracked by dry air. Hair was cleaned with fermented water from boiled tree bark. And slowly, as needs rose, so did innovations. By the 10th and 11th centuries, knowledge from across the Sahel began to spread. Traders brought techniques from the Berber caravans. Builders began lining wells with interlocked bricks. Some villagers built thatched shelters over their waterholes to reduce evaporation and keep animals away. Others organized small water councils, women who determined when water could be drawn for what, and through it all, bathing remained a spiritual task. A sick child might be rubbed with a paste made of shea, honey, and blessed water. A man preparing for a journey might bathe in silence at dawn, using a special basin no one else touched. Even among Islamic converts in the region, traditional beliefs were folded into the practice. Wudu was performed before prayer. Yes, but often with water that had first been blessed or poured through medicinal leaves. There was no separation between hygiene and hope. To wash was to remember, to connect, to preserve something quiet and human in the midst of hardship. And yet, wells were not perfect. They dried, collapsed, became poisoned by salt or by use. When this happened, the people did not despair. They adapted again, they moved, or dug deeper, or returned to catching rain from rooftops with stretched leather, channeling it into clay cisterns, filtering it through gravel, boiling it with bark. Bathing never stopped, even if it was done with only half a bowl or with water reused from rinsed millet. It continued. It had to, because without it, the people felt lost. Not dirty, just unbalanced, as if the dust had reached somewhere it wasn't supposed to. In today's world, it's hard to picture this kind of patience. Hard to imagine the time it took to carry water, to measure each cup, to wash your hands with the knowledge that someone else might need that same water an hour later. But in the quiet rhythm of medieval West Africa, that was the way, and no one complained. They sang as they fetched, laughed while bathing the children, prayed quietly as the water ran over their heads, because even in drought, washing was a way of saying, we are still here. So the question remains, when water is no longer free-falling from the sky, how do you keep the spirit of cleansing alive? What rituals rise when resources fall? By the time the 13th century rolled in like dust across the Sahel, the land had grown more connected. The empires of Mali and Songhai were rising. Gold moved through trade routes like wind through grass. So did books, so did sultan, so did ideas. But not all changes came from merchants or kings. Some came from within, in the villages' quiet ones. Far from the noise of Jeunesse libraries or Timbuktu's mosques, people still bathed with bowls, still scrubbed their arms with ash, still boiled bark over fire and stirred it into water with a stick carved by a grandparent long gone. But slowly, something was shifting. Islam had come, carried by traders, scribes, and wandering imams, and with it came new ways of thinking about water, its purity, its use, its place in ritual. Suddenly, washing became not only a village tradition, but a commandment. Wudu, the ablution before prayer, required water clean, fresh, untouched by dirt or decay. In the dry season, this wasn't always possible, so tayammum was used instead, a ritual cleansing done with clean earth or dust. This practice, already ancient in origin, found an unexpected harmony with local beliefs, because for many West African cultures, earth had always been holy. It held the bones of ancestors. It gave millet, mangoes, and she. Now, it also cleansed, so villagers didn't abandon their old ways. They wove the new ones into them. A woman might wash a baby with rainwater blessed by an imam, but still stir it with neem leaves passed down by her grandmother. A man might perform wudu from a well dug by his father, still ringed with the stones of an older world. There was no conflict, just continuity. Fires were built not just to cook but to purify water. Stones were heated until they hissed, then dropped into calabashes to boil water. This helped kill parasites, yes, but it also warmed the water for small children and the elderly. Warm water was gentler, easier to use, especially during Harmattan, when the wind blew dry and cold from the Sahara, and skin cracked like pottery. Ash, once used alone, was now mixed with imported soaps. Villagers began making their own bars, some shaped like tiny huts, others like discs stamped with patterns. They were traded at markets, stored like treasure, and hair, once cleaned with mud and herbs, was now treated with oil and covered with cloth to preserve both style and spirit. In the act of bathing, nothing was lost, only deepened. Even death did not stop the washing. When someone passed, their body was not simply buried, it was cleaned, dressed, and honored. In Islamic practice, this washing, called ghusl al-mayat, was essential. And even before Islam arrived, many villages had their own rites for preparing the dead: gentle sponge baths with special leaves, whispered prayers, the use of river stones to weigh down the limbs and show peace. Women washed women, men washed men. Elders guided the process, sometimes blind with age but sharp in memory. The dead were not just mourned, they were soothed. Their bodies returned to the earth the same way they had lived, clean, dressed, and wrapped with care. Even in finality, the act of washing remained sacred, and yet, this wasn't just a story of tradition. Washing also meant resistance. In times of drought, people didn't give up. They built clay cisterns underground, shaded by thorny acacia trees. They dug deep pits lined with shea bark to preserve water's coolness. Some carved trenches to guide rare rainfall into communal basins. And in times of conflict, when raiders came, when rulers taxed too harshly, when children were taken, the people still found ways to wash, not because it made life easier, but because it made life feel like life. Even small children were taught the value of bathing, not just how to scrub elbows or rinse behind ears, but when to bathe before prayers, after touching the sick, before planting, after harvest, before a long journey, after a fight, because water did not just cleanse skin, it cooled anger, marked time, offered forgiveness. A child who misbehaved was not shouted at, they were sent to the water, told to wash, to think. The stream, or bowl, or trickle from a clay jarret became a pause, a reset in a world without clocks. Water measured rhythm, and now, in our time, much of this has changed. Plastic buckets, piped water, concrete wells, soap with French or Arabic labels, rainwater forgotten behind tin roofs. But if you truly go, beyond the cities, past the old trade roads, some of it is still there. You'll see a mother crouched in mourning light, washing her daughter with warm water, humming an old tune no one remembers the words to. You'll see boys carrying water to their grandmothers in blackened pots, their bare feet tracing the same paths their ancestors walked. You'll hear laughter, splashing arguments over who gets the last rinse, or the only bar of soap left. You'll smell ash, neem, clay, the memory of rain. Washing, in the medieval villages of West Africa, was never just about hygiene. It was about honor, survival, connection. It was a language, a quiet, wet, slow language that said, you are alive, you are human, and you are part of something older than yourself. And in the silence of night, as the fire crackled low and the last pot was scrubbed, the basin was poured out, not wasted, but returned to the earth, always returned. So tonight, as you rest, you might ask yourself, what are the rituals of cleansing in your life? When was the last time water truly felt sacred to you? And with that, our journey across muddy paths, rainy skies, and slow sacred baths comes to a gentle end.